Hello, my name is Matthew Sortino and welcome to Their Stories Unbroken. Their Stories Unbroken is a podcast that explores how the Holocaust has impacted the lives of Jewish Australians. Through long-form conversation with first, second and third generation survivors, we will not only bear witness to the experiences of those that lived through the Shoah, but look to gain an insight into what it is like growing up as a descendant of survivors in the shadow of the Holocaust. I aim to not only capture these stories, these histories, but when possible find ways to educate along the way. I am very aware that our audience will be made up of people with a great deal of expertise in the subject matter, but also those that may be new to many of the ideas explored throughout the podcast. Their Stories Unbroken will obviously have a focus on the Holocaust or Shoah, which is the Hebrew term for the Holocaust meaning catastrophe, but it will also seek to navigate the unique experiences of Australian Jewry, especially Melbourne, which is home to one of the highest concentrations of Jewish Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. As we explore life before, during and after the Holocaust through the lens of both survivors and their descendants, we will also learn about Jewish culture and the different ways people connect to their Jewish identity. So that is an overview of the purpose of the podcast. But I'm sure many of you are wondering, who am I? My name is Matthew Sortino and I'm currently Head of Humanities at Bialik College in Melbourne, Australia. Bialik College is a pluralist Jewish school of over 1,100 children aged between 0 and 18 years old. I am in my third year at Bialik College, but have been a teacher for over 13 years in the Catholic, public and now independent sectors, across both primary and secondary education settings. Recently, I completed the Gandil Holocaust Studies program for Australian educators. This program was delivered through Yad Vashem, but due to the ongoing conflict following the October 7, 2023 terror attacks by Hamas, we completed the course in Melbourne instead of Israel. 3 exceptional Israeli experts led a team of 20 Australian educators in a truly life-changing learning experience. It was this program that inspired me to begin this podcast. The first thing to note is that I am not Jewish. Before arriving at Bialik College, I had very little interaction with the Jewish community, except through my love of many Jewish comedians, academics, journalists, authors and actors. In my role, I have been welcomed with open arms and have learnt so much about Jewish culture. It is safe to say that I have developed a deep affinity with the pluralist values of not only the school, but of the Melbourne Jewish community at large. As a history teacher, I feel I have a good understanding of the Holocaust too. But as with all academic pursuits, the more you learn, the more you realise you don't know. It is in this unique and privileged position as a history teacher at a Jewish school, with such a connection to the Holocaust, that I start this venture. I want to learn and share these learnings with Jews and non-Jews alike. We are currently living through a time of deep uncertainty and upheaval. Throughout history we have seen moments of hate, and although history does not repeat, it certainly does rhyme. Unfortunately, hate is festering again, and one of the world's longest enduring and most perverse hatred, that of anti-Semitism, is prevalent. Anti-Semitism does not just affect Jews. Time and again in history we have seen anti-Semitism perform the role of canary in the coal mine for waves of violence, war and genocide. It is my hope that through conversation, vulnerability and bearing witness, we can all learn to be upstanders and stand up to anti-Semitism and all hate wherever we see it. In 1933, 9.5 million Jews lived in Europe. They made up 1.7% of the European population and lived normal lives. They were diverse in beliefs, backgrounds, education and class. The highest population of Jews was in Poland, making up nearly 10% of Polish citizens. But Jews were present in every country. European Jewry made up 60% of the world's 15.3 million Jews at the time. By 1945, Nazi Germany and their collaborators had killed 6 million individuals. Individuals with a story, with a family, with hopes, and with dreams. It is widely accepted that 6 million Jews were killed while the world was distracted by World War II. However, genocide does not begin with death camps. H. Stanton, president of Genocide Watch, developed the idea of the 10 stages of genocide. He ascertained that the Holocaust did not begin in 1939, but with the birth of the Nazi regime in 1933. This horror did not develop in a vacuum though, with anti-Semitism rampant throughout Europe and beyond. This is typified by the pogroms throughout the Russian Empire of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and a more latent anti-Semitism in the West by an invisible wall and prejudice many Jews experienced, typified by the Dreyfus Affair in France in 1894 to 1906. The world turned a blind eye to the growing discrimination, dehumanisation and persecution aimed at Jews there and elsewhere, leading to an environment that fostered the genocidal ideology of Hitler and the Nazi Party. It is imperative that we preserve the memory of those who were murdered by the seemingly unfathomable actions of other human beings. Likewise, there is so much value in learning from the raw stories of survival, of resilience, of hope and of courage, against all odds, whether Jews, non-Jews or righteous among the nations, those who risked their own lives to save the lives of Jews when so many others refused. One of the key pillars of Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Centre based in Jerusalem, is to place the human being, the individual, at the centre of our understanding of history. As an educator, the Holocaust must be taught through age-appropriate content that can be entered into and exited in a safe manner. We can do this by telling the story of the individual in 3 stages: before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, and after the Holocaust. We are privileged to have had survivors share their testimony on the horrors of the Holocaust and how their lives were forever changed. We can access tens of thousands of these accounts through books, Holocaust museums and archives such as the USC Shoah Foundation. These are often stories shared in chronological order, recalling memories from before, during and after World War II, with a focus rightly on bearing witness to the Holocaust itself. Although one of the most harrowing events in history, for many survivors, life began after 1945, with the end of World War II in Europe and the defeat of Germany. This is especially true for their descendants, who live the legacy of their family history. These descendants are both a link to the tragedies of the past, but also the ultimate resistance against evil. Their Stories Unbroken hopes to shine a light on the continuity and strength of the Jewish people, with a focus not just on memory, but on the ongoing contribution to Australia and the world. If you would like to find out more about this podcast, our guests, or topics discussed during the episode, please see the show notes. If you have any questions, comments, or would simply like to have a chat, you can email theirstoriesunbroken@gmail.com. In episode 1 of the podcast, I will be talking to Jeremy Stowe-Lindner and Amanda Castelan-Starr, both from Bialik College in Melbourne, Australia. Jeremy is principal of Bialik College, where he has been since 2012. Originally from the UK, he was the founding head teacher of Jewish Community Secondary School, just outside of London. He is a history teacher, a preeminent school leader, and an active community leader. Jeremy is a fellow for the Australian Council for Educational Leaders and has volunteered as a board member of a number of not-for-profit organisations. Amanda is assistant principal and director of Jewish Life at Bialik College. She has taught Jewish studies for over 25 years, with the majority of her time as a curriculum leader of Jewish studies at Mount Scopus Memorial College. Amanda completed the Senior Educators Program at Hebrew University and has studied several courses at Yad Vashem. The teaching of the Shoah has been an integral part of her career in Jewish education and also plays a significant role in Amanda's personal family history. And now, without further delay, I bring you Jeremy and Amanda. Jeremy, Amanda, welcome.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
I want to start, this whole project and podcast is based around Bialik College in Melbourne, Victoria, to start and to frame the stories that we're going to hear and the experiences of families that we're going to be hearing in the next few episodes. I'd like to get a little bit of that history and the feel of what Bialik is and then extend that to Melbourne and what better guests to have on than the principal and assistant principal of Bialik College, Jeremy as the principal. Can you give us a little bit of history about what Bialik is and where it began?
Absolutely. So Bialik is technically the oldest Jewish school in Melbourne. It was founded in 1942, which is a really interesting year because that's right in the middle of the war, when death and destruction was facing the Jewish community and other Jewish communities around the world. And as a response to that, whilst the other echelons of Maslow's hierarchy of needs were probably people's focus in terms of food and refuge and flight and methods to achieve those, there was an element within the Bialik Jewish community that decided to set up a school. And I love that. I love that as you know what, now's the time to set up a school. And in 1942, they called it Bialik. It's named after the poet Chaim Nachman Bialik, who went on a journey himself, started his life as a member of a very religious family, was very learned, and became increasingly secular, was one of the effective architects of Hebrew as a modern living language, settled in Israel, and died in 1934. He was nicknamed the King of the Jews and became like a secular leader of community, not politically, but in terms of literature, poetry, writings, became a bit of an advisor to people. And his journey from religious to secular, so he could span both worlds, really fits, from what I can understand, of the Bialik founders. Whereas most Hebrew schools, Sunday schools within and set up by the Jewish community around the world were generally religious, they were looking for a much more cultural alternative, a Hebrew alternative, a Zionistic-focused alternative before the State of Israel had been founded. And to come up with Bialik's name just 8 years after he passed away shows the impact that he had if this community here in Melbourne was inspired by him. The community at that time would have been co-dominated by two groups. The older establishment group would have been more Anglo-centric, and increasing immigration from Eastern and Central Europe certainly beginning to come in. The mass immigration took place immediately after the war, but certainly that had begun before the war, dried up pretty much during the war for obvious reasons. So it would have been a reasonably broad tent. Having said that, the school was set up in Carlton, which was an immigrant destination, whereas the more established Jews were more, if you know your Melbourne geography, in the St Kilda, Toorak, those kind of areas, hence those establishment synagogues that are there. So its catchment would have been significantly immigrant at that time. Started off as a preschool, as a kindergarten, extended to primary school, and didn't go fully towards a all-age secondary school until about 35 years ago. So in the community, the largest Jewish school is Mount Scopus Memorial College, which is its official name, and that really tells you about on what ashes that school was built. Very much a survivor community, setting up that community there. And the two communities, in terms of their catchments, would have merged over time. Starting as a secular Zionist school, Bialik has more recently shifted into a more American-inspired pluralist zone. So rather than a secular cultural Jewish default that is non-religious, it has become much more trans-denominational within the Jewish community, with a broader skill set and zooming out from a more purely cultural lens to a more religious element to it as well.
Thank you, Amanda. I want to get to your story, Jeremy, and also yours, Amanda. I do want to start with Melbourne and about the Jewish community in Melbourne, both before and after the war, and I guess what impact, I guess the main topic of this podcast is, which is the Shoah, which is the Holocaust.
Growing up in Melbourne in the 80s, the Shoah really is a defining moment for me and all my peers growing up in Melbourne. You know, the generation of the 80s, it was always something that when we were young, when we were teens reading our first novels at school, we would dream about surviving the Holocaust, what it would be like to be on a train, jump off the train, what it would be like, etc. And they were things we'd speak about as young people. We were very used to being exposed to pictures of the Holocaust, even as early as year 5 or 4 in my memories, that probably today we wouldn't be showing kids those sorts of photos. So we didn't have a sense of what was appropriate or not appropriate, but it was definitely there. It was in the air. It was in the pictures. It was in the stories. It was our grandparents. It was their accents. We thought that when we grew old, we would speak like that with those accents. It was just that's what adults were.
So you touched on education there and the way that things have changed at Bialik and I guess in modern contexts. How do we approach education about the Holocaust within the Jewish context and also about Jewish life more broadly as well? How do you balance those?
Yeah. I was talking to a mentor of mine in my early years teaching with Sue Hampel, who's very much one of the most knowledgeable people about the Holocaust in our community. And we used to have a joke, which is a little bit of a bad taste joke, but we used to say, when in doubt, teach the Holocaust. And it was this idea that automatically our students were so engaged and interested in anything that we would do if we just spoke about the Holocaust. And knowing that as educators, we used to have a lot of conversations that we wanted to make sure that Jewish education wasn't just based on the Holocaust, so that their identity was more than that. It wasn't be a Jew because that'll prove a victory against Hitler. It was, let's make sure that our education is let's be Jewish, because being Jewish is a wonderfully enriching experience, because Judaism is so much more than the Holocaust. So that was something we as educators were always aware about. So we made sure in our electives or in the curriculum that it had its balanced place. It wasn't too much, but at the same time, given there was so much attraction and it's compelling in nature to read and understand it. I mean, I've read so much about the Holocaust, and the more I read and learn about it, the more I don't understand about it. So there's something that draws you in more and more to want to know more and more, but the more that we do learn about it, it is actually incomprehensible.
That's the word for it, I think. And in my recent, little exposure to learning about the Holocaust in depth, the incomprehensible nature of it just kept hitting me. And it's interesting that Yad Vashem and the educators that came along, their focus was that there isn't one narrative arc that we can follow. There is not one linear reason and motive even, that there was so much chaos even within the despicable Nazi regime that even though there was much anti-Semitism leading up and genocidal ideals, that it didn't quite happen until later. And when it did happen, it was a bit chaotic and less top-down than we believe. And that was really interesting to come from those educators to hear that. I won't get sidetracked by that though.
No, but it is really interesting because as teachers we come in that similar model of top-down, that this is what the government was, this is what the system was, this is what happened. And then along comes a book about a village in Poland in which not one Nazi had to do one bad thing and everything was done by the locals.
Yep.
And how do we deal with those situations? And our kids in our classroom and their parents and grandparents are people who actually lived that.
Yeah.
So the students being in the classroom, sharing the stories, would sometimes bring in more real accounts than what the teachers would know themselves from their readings, because these experiences came from below.
Yeah. And part of this podcast, there's, maybe, I guess, three main areas that I do want to touch on, and that's education and testimony and bearing witness to the Holocaust from those that lived it, but then also touching on that multi-generational memory and that idea of trauma that's bound to be there as descendants. And the third part is looking at the idea of hate and anti-Semitism and that we're facing growing anti-Semitism in the world, that's whether it was underlying and dormant and it's popped out since October 7 and the Hamas attacks in Israel, or whether it's something new that we need to face. But looking at history, the idea is to say that we can never accept and never be a bystander to the beginnings of the 10 stages of genocide, that idea of beginning with a classification or a dehumanizing aspect of a people. Because, as I say in the intro, that the idea that it didn't start in camps, it started much before that. And to highlight the idea of the Jewish experience and the idea of the Jewish story, helping maybe people that don't have as much to do with the Jewish community have a closer sense of understanding of what that means. So they're the things that I want to touch on. Jeremy, your experience was a little bit different growing up, not a direct experience with the Holocaust yourself and not being in Australia. What was your life like as a Jewish person growing up in the UK?
So the UK Jewish community is a very different demographic to the Australian Jewish community, in that the bulk of the UK Jewish community arrived in the UK in the 1860s through to the 1890s. Really, the 1870s and 1880s were probably peak. So the UK's wartime experience is very different to that of the Australian Jewish community. The UK's wartime experience was as part of the armed forces or as part of the civilian community in the UK. And of course, mainland UK wasn't invaded. It faced the Blitz, it faced bombings, it launched invasions. So my grandparents, I have a Royal Engineers grandfather who was not in the first wave of the Normandy landings, but in the later waves. And on my other side was RAF. And that's very typical. So if you go to a UK Jewish school, for example, Jewish schools around the world do B'nai Mitzvah ceremonies, and often they're telling stories of their families. And here in Australia, most stories are Holocaust stories. And if you go to a school in the UK, very occasionally you'll perk up in the audience and go, oh, that's interesting, that's a Holocaust family. I come from the north of England, from Leeds, and there's a very small number of Holocaust survivors. There's Arik Hirsch, who is still alive, and Arik is an outstanding mensch, human, and community member, but also a bit of a celebrity, because Arik is the Holocaust survivor in that community, which is highly unusual, whereas here it will be the norm. And I married into a Holocaust family. So my wife's family is entirely Holocaust affected. She has just two cousins in the world. On one side of her family, her mum's sister didn't marry and didn't have children. And on the other side of the family, the sibling of her father had two children, and that's it. There are no cousins. There's no extended. So it's very unusual for me it was unusual at the time to go, oh, wow, that's interesting. That's a very, very small and tight-knit family with a very different family dynamic to a more established UK Jewish family with extended family network that generally survived the war.
Amanda, when we talk about survivors of the Holocaust, can you provide a little bit of a definition or your definition of what that means and how it may have changed over time?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I remember in the classroom sometimes we would be having an up-and-coming Yom HaShoah assembly and looking for people who might like to light a candle in memory of their family. And we would I remember distinctly one boy saying, we're not survivors, but my grandmother was in hiding the whole time. Yeah. So there was this idea that to be a survivor meant you actually had to be at Auschwitz, experience Auschwitz. Even Auschwitz versus other camps, there's even a hierarchy about that. Over time, the idea of survivor has become much broader for us because we have a much clearer sense that anyone who lost family is a survivor coming out. My mum's family came out in 1939 and they never felt like survivors because they missed the worst parts of it. But they left because of it, and they lost all their family except for two cousins who came out to Tasmania at the end. Are they survivors? So these are the questions of the details. So from our perspective, anyone that's dealing with the impact and trauma on their families coming out of Europe, they're survivors.
And to frame that, there's the idea of surviving the brutality of I guess, attempted murder, whether in whatever context that may have been, versus leaving your home, leaving your country, leaving your family behind, friends behind, livelihoods behind in many ways. And I think that, the idea of removing that doesn't sit right, although I'm no authority there, but it doesn't sit right that those people would be excluded. But I do understand how, when telling the stories, that you would feel maybe an imposter syndrome in a way. Hang on, I can't talk about my trauma, my pain, my hurt, because I wasn't actually starved or beaten or lost everyone, and then that's not to mention all those people that were killed and perished in that time frame.
A lot of people have written directly about that subject as well, and survivors speak about we were lucky and then explain the bad things that happened and what that means to be lucky.
Yeah, the way we frame it.
Yeah.
I think a complicating factor as well is people's willingness to talk. And what I've witnessed in the family network that I'm in is that the first generation of the survivors were very reluctant to talk. They'd come somewhere new, they were setting up a new life, and they were looking to close a door and open a new one. But then when you go through papers after a grandparent passes away, you find significant prescriptions for antidepressants from the 1950s, sleeping tablets. So you can see that there was trauma, but it may not have been talked about well. And what I hear anecdotally as an educator is that one of the information liberating experiences was the family history projects that was done in the 1980s and 1990s in the Jewish schools. I suspect started at Mount Scopus, where the grandchildren of survivors were going home and wanting to talk and research and interview. And that unleashed an information flow. And I think a change of attitude from some of the survivors who were at that point shifting away from work and towards retirement, had time and different perspectives, and maybe becoming aware of their own mortality and realizing that there was information to share that if it wasn't shared would be lost. So that seems to have liberated a desire to share and talk, whereas in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was more of a, we've moved on, we need to now set up a new life. That was in the past, and it doesn't serve anyone to talk about this.
It's also a different relationship, parents to children and grandparents. And I think the distance of the grandparent relationship versus the parent also enabled them to speak about things that they maybe still couldn't tell their children, even at the same time when they were ready to share their story.
And they may have blocked things out. I remember attending a family dinner where one member of the family questioned Grandma and said, "Hey, Grandma, when you were in hiding, did Grandpa grow a beard?" And she said, "Oh, I can't remember." And he said, "What do you mean you can't remember? You were stuck in a basement for a year and a half." And they kind of, "Oh, I don't remember these things." He goes, "Well, did he shave? Did he have a nut? Did he have water? What did he look like?" And it was a really interesting interaction because Grandma didn't want to talk about it. She said she couldn't remember, but actually she just didn't want to reflect on that. But there was a desire from the younger generation, I want to know, I need to know, how can you not share this with me? And as a non-Australian witness to this family dynamic, it was uncomfortable, but illuminating at the same time.
One of the questions that often I've heard come up is, do we have a right to read, publish, explore the stories, the diaries, the photos of people that either died or these things were found many years later when they had died in their old age, many years after the Holocaust? And what place is there for that privacy and that intimacy to remain versus sharing the word and bearing that witness and allowing other people, family and beyond, to see that? And that's something that needs to, I guess, be explored. Have you thought much about that, Amanda?
Well, there's definitely conflicting sensibilities even in the one family, A wife might like to share her diary, but her husband might not want her to because it exposes them to, there's different relationships that it's connected. So it's very complex. And it's like humans. Every human will have a different response to that. I think as time goes by and the stories become more distant, people generally become a little bit more detached to those sentiments. But up close, we're seeing the difference between them. Like, we've just had a new trauma in Jewish history with October 7, and it's really interesting watching how quickly memorials have sprouted and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and in different contexts. So I think time does play a large role as well. People need time before they can share.
I'm a history teacher, and I do feel that things are part of a historical record, and there is an obligation to research, and people recorded for purpose. May not be the purpose that they intended, but they still recorded for purpose. I do have qualms over one type of historical evidence, which is the photographic evidence, because we've all been haunted and seen the images of naked people being herded. And I think what people forget is that some of these people would have been deeply religious. And aside from shame or embarrassment that any of us would feel revealing, ourselves in a state of undress in those horrific circumstances, many of those people, because of their religiosity, wouldn't have shown parts of their body to their nearest and dearest or uncovered their hair. They would have worn hair coverings. And then we have on public display in museums people, some of whom are anonymous and some of whom are not, in that state of undress. And from a religious perspective and a kindness perspective to those religious people, that does shake me a little bit, because under no circumstances, you can see where in some circumstances a diary or another form of record would be willing to share in retrospect, but under no circumstances would that religious framework permit that sharing.
But even if we take the religious lens from it, many, many people, regardless of their religious practice, would not feel comfortable other people seeing them in those photos. So I think they are sometimes important questions to ask students to think about before they are interacting, to keep things in mind, to make sure we're maintaining a sense of humanity and we're not losing that sense in our education.
Part of education today and Yad Vashem's pedagogy and model is to have a safely in and safely out way of appropriately tackling the content at an age-appropriate level, but then also how much time do you have to reflect, to decompress, all of those things afterwards, and also the idea that we can't just see this as a number and an event in history, but we have to go to the story, the individual stories, and that's a really key thing about this podcast too, to hear those individual stories and not just see it as 6 million as a number, but one story 6 million times. In education, in your life as distinguished educators and people that have touched on this directly and then with leading teams, what method have you used that's worked well, and then what's something that you might not do anymore? And I know you touched something on how you were introduced to it, Amanda, but how is the best way for you to discuss this? Maybe in a school context, but then also maybe with young children of your family as well.
I think the school is always going to be in a difficult position because, we talk about age, but within any age group, there's a variety of maturities, readinesses, and life experiences that will inform how appropriate it is. When I first came to Bialik, it's my first role in a primary school as well as a secondary school. My first Yom HaShoah was the first of many which I would get parental complaints from primary school parents about what they perceived to be the content that was being taught to their children. And I'd always receive the complaints and think, oh, crikey, what have they done now? And then you'd look into it, and it was always much more complex, because the parent might say, and they were being taught about gas chambers in year 4. And then you'd get in touch with the year 4 teacher or the Jewish studies coordinator, and they'd say, no, of course I wouldn't teach year 4. But somebody put up their hand and said, my grandma, blah, 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 gas chambers. And then I'm there with 20 children, and I don't want to shut it down, but at the same time I need to answer in an age-appropriate way. So it is an absolute minefield to get it right. But I think, like with all aspects of education, to stage it and scaffold it, but most importantly, to be thoughtful about it. Don't blunder into it. Just think it through. And when you're in an all-age school like Bialik is, you have the opportunity to zoom out and look at the curricular experience in a holistic way. So you can stagger it and scaffold it and stage it as you go through schooling and as you develop your curriculum.
There are so many different instances that come to mind in a lot of different contexts which need to have thoughtful, meaningful conversations to reflect on and consider whether it is appropriate, not appropriate. We had questions about whether it was appropriate to use Roman Polanski's movie The Pianist, which is a brilliant film about the Holocaust for the students to learn. Yet Roman Polanski, with the crimes that he's been convicted of, is there a problem using that film when he himself is a survivor and the scenes of the deportation were considered by many to be the most real for students to understand from. Anyway, lots of different questions about appropriateness do come up with the Holocaust education, also going to a trip to Poland, and at what age and what's appropriate to do on that trip. Is it part of an Israel trip? Do we always end our Shoah education with, and we went to Israel, and we established, or do we keep them separate stories? Do we put these stories together as if it's part of the same story? There's a lot of debate about these sorts of questions, and I think these questions are going to continue and that they're important for us to be having, and I think sometimes there are changes that we do make as the students and the generations are changing. There are things that we used to do that we wouldn't do anymore. I remember, again, many years ago at the start of my career, one of the things one teacher did was put little yellow Magen Davids with paper clips for each kid to wear for the day and feel what it would like to be wearing that. That's a big no-no now.
Yeah, no role-playing, isn't it?
No role-playing. Yeah, so there are these questions pedagogically that we sometimes need to have the conversation again with teachers to remind that sensitivity and thoughtfulness, and sometimes teachers might step over the mark wanting to engage the kids because sometimes the kids don't feel as connected or engaged in the subject. So how far can a teacher go to excite, entertain, connect?
Yeah.
And the student reactions themselves and the parent reactions will be different. I mean, here at Bialik we do a beautiful project of creative responses to family stories during the B'nai Mitzvah year. And I remember a couple of years ago there were two pieces, and kids do biographies, they do art pieces, they do glass works, etchings on mirrors, it's all different types of art. And a couple of years ago we had two pieces that were very confronting. One was a giant swastika on a Nazi flag with some commentary around it, and it was big and red. And another piece was, from an artistic perspective, a brilliantly crafted model clay of a German soldier shooting people in a ditch. Both incredibly confronting. And we learnt from that because we learnt to put some guardrails and thoughts around the brief. But the students, having done that, we then had a discussion. Now, had we done that, I think, in a UK school, there would have been a lot of concern from the parent body. We chose to put it in a corner of the room with a curtain with an advisory on it. And of course, if you do that, everybody's straight in there. That's got to be fun. And then when you pull back the curtain, you're confronted with a giant swastika and people being shot in a ditch. And I expected some concerns to be voiced and received none. And I can't quite unpack that fully because I'm not sure if that was because people weren't concerned or they felt they shouldn't be concerned or it wouldn't be appropriate to express concern. I think there's five other reasons as well.
That you had the decision makers there had decided that this shouldn't be a part of the mainstream showing, but behind a curtain was maybe the solution, and then everyone thought, that's good.
Play it out the other way, what would have happened.
Yeah. Or was that a problem in itself to censor in that way? So it was a fascinating and slightly disturbing process of decision-making before the exhibition and then reflection afterwards. But it goes to show, this isn't studying the English Civil War or, the Mary Rose or something very banal. This is very emotive and has to be so thoughtfully crafted together as an educational piece.
Yeah. The idea of legacy, the idea of multi-generational, intergenerational, and you touched on before, Amanda, the idea that we are losing those that were directly touched by World War II and by the Shoah as well, that we're losing that ability to have a direct experience with someone that was there, to see the tattoos on the arms, to in whatever context it was, to feel that emotion and to see that this was not that long ago. And part of this podcast is to not let that disappear, and not only through story but through, I guess, the unbroken stories of families that have not only survived but even thrived and built again in life to succeed, to not succeed. There's plenty of people that haven't succeeded or haven't quite been able to have that experience live in memory without being debilitating as well. So I really want to capture those stories. So, and part of that will be hearing multi-generational stories from families. But from, I guess, both of you with very different backgrounds and different experiences, how has the Holocaust impacted the way that you live your life? And I'll start with you, Jeremy.
So in terms of my childhood and early career, it was very much, this is what happened to our people, but other people. And then coming to Australia, being in a survivor community and marrying into a survivor family, it's present. It's present much more. I don't think you can go to a community event without somebody mentioning it. If you had a bingo card, it would certainly be on your bingo card of, Holocaust has been mentioned. And there's just little things. Like, for example, we have a Holocaust memorial at the school. That wouldn't happen in a UK, or I'm sure in a number of American Jewish schools. And it may not even happen in many Israeli schools. Because kind of the solution is Israel, and they've moved on to the next stage in their view. I think I've found that the Zionistic identification of the Australian Jewish community is much stronger and more centred to the right. And I think, in my view, part of the reason for that is because it is a survivor community and Israel is seen as refuge and defender. Whereas if you come from the United Kingdom, then that country was refuge and defender. So that engenders a different relationship with the state of Israel and the people of Israel, despite distance, which is greater. And in family, humour, conversations, I don't want to speak for my wife, but she always leaves something on her plate. Now, I don't know if that's her natural personality to leave something on her plate, or if that's a reaction to the survivor stereotype of finishing everything on your plate. So therefore, the next generation, as we all do, rebel and then does the opposite.
I could ask her that, actually.
I think you should. So it's there in whispers, in a far more present and real sense than the community that I've come from.
Yeah. And Amanda, I want to ask the same question to you, and in another episode give you a chance to share, and you and your family to share their story too. But can you give just a little bit of background about what that history is, and then how you growing up with that legacy, was it a part of the fabric of who you are and what you experienced growing up, the legacy of the Holocaust, and how has it shaped you to who you are today?
I think that sometimes it's the silences that we read into more so than sometimes the noises as well. I grew up in Brighton, and I knew that was a conscious decision, mostly by my mum, to live outside of the ghetto. Yeah, and there's this idea of being safer if you're not with everyone in the community together. Now that would have been coming out of her parents' direct experience, because her family story was they got out just in time, and they wish that everyone else in the family would have listened and come with. Yeah, that kind of sense and that guilt of having survived and not feeling that you have anything to say in the conversation because you got out before. So that's the backdrop of it. I think that being involved in education over the years, I've learnt for myself on my own journey, one of the reasons that attracted me to live a more religious life, to be a more committed Jew, was the marvelling at how we did survive the Holocaust. So the Holocaust was a big thing, and I remember learning a lot about it. And I was truly amazed and fascinated by, against all odds, any resistance was quite astounding or amazing when studying all the details of the system and how big it was and the numbers, etc. So that sense of purpose, that there's a purpose for the community or there's a purpose for the Jewish people, that something continues regardless of what has happened, and that as a religious person, that story, the Shoah is not the first of those stories. There are many stories throughout Jewish history of survival against adversities that play a large role in the migrations and the different communities and movements that have settled all over the world and created such diversity in the Jewish community. But also it highlights something very strong about the insides of the Jewish community in terms of what's needed for community to establish itself, to continue and to thrive. And every family, every generation, everyone has a choice whether they want to be in that or outside of that. And I guess what has become very real for me through the Holocaust is I don't want any student to also feel forced to come to any conclusion that is given to them about the way they should be living their lives in the future. But there is something very special about being part of a community that chooses to invest its energies and efforts into supporting each other, having each other's back, giving charity, getting on with life, building a career, valuing education, investing in careers that are going to make a positive impact in the community, and those careers change each generation based on what's going on. That sort of adaptability and flexibility and response to what's going on, to me, is something quite awesome and quite wonderful. But I don't want to talk about that alone, because there's a lot of tragedy and sadness and a lot of trauma that people do carry coming out of these events as well. And it would be, as historians, unfair to just be looking at one story of heroes and not the full story of the different things that have happened to our people.
Yep.
So in Israel, for instance, Holocaust survivors for the first 20, 30 years in Israel never felt comfortable sharing their stories because their stories were looked down upon by the founders of the state because they didn't fight or they weren't considered fighters or warriors. And the only stories that were shared in the early years were those that raised arms and fought back in a very physical way. But over time, we teach our students about resistance in different forms. Not everyone had that luxury to be fighters and made other choices of resistance. So
hosting a Shabbat dinner, holding your bread for the day and eating it together after sunset or things like that.
Is a sign of resistance.
Celebrating something, reading with the hope of survival, to learn a new language or something. These amazing stories that are resistance, that aren't fighting.
And there's like a beautiful photo of people lighting a Chanukiah in one of the camps. And in Yad Vashem, there's a beautiful exhibition space of the different things that people created during the war years in order to still preserve their identity. So those things also give a lot of sense of strength and hope for the Jewish people against adversities.
I think what you say also about focusing on the glimmer of hope, the resistance, the fight back, it's a natural human desire, especially in a time of overwhelming tragedy and the sheer numbers of deaths relative to the numbers of fightbacks. But I don't think it's a coincidence that Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, the day that was chosen was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now, they had a handful of weapons, and actually my wife's grandparents were actually two of the few that escaped in the sewers from that uprising. And it didn't achieve much other than as a symbol of resistance. But it's interesting that that was chosen because there's not a lot of hope and there's not a lot of hopeful scenarios to choose from when commemorating that day.
Before ending this episode, and thank you so much for being here, is there a last message or something you'd like to leave us with before saying goodbye?
One thing that's important to me, that we often start our Shoah education lessons with the question, why study the Shoah? For what purpose? And most people will say, to learn the lesson never again. You know, that's usually the mantra. And I think that when we read the newspapers and see things happening again and again, that can't be a justification for learning it when we're not doing enough to change things, and these things are happening again and again. So I think it's a very interesting question that might come up through the other stories about why learn the Shoah, for what purpose, and if it is going to play such a significant role in our schools and our community, I think we need to be really careful about offering more reasons about why we do need to study it than just never again. Yeah. That is one important reason, but there are many more.
Yeah. And I think I would add that when we study things in history, we don't often, I mean, we study war, certainly, but we also, when we look at societies, we don't often focus on the decline or destruction of that society. So if we look at the Golden Age of Spain, we look at the Golden Age of Spain. We don't focus hugely on the decline of the Golden Age of Spain. If we look at Elizabethan England, we do that same thing. We don't look at the decline of Elizabethan England or any wars that followed. And at my last school, just bear with me with this thought, there's a brand new school, JCOS, the Jewish Community Secondary School in London, and we're setting up a new school, and schools in the UK do a Holocaust trip. They go to Auschwitz, they go to Belsenod. And we made the decision, and I felt very strongly about it, that we wouldn't do the conventional thing. And instead of going to a death camp, we went to Prague and Budapest to really focus on the society that was before the Holocaust. And the center of Ashkenazi, European Jewish life, that centered on Central and Eastern Europe, and the vibrancy and academia of both cultural and religious Jewish communities. So I would want us to focus more on that. I don't think we should dilute the Holocaust in any way, but not just focus on what was lost, but what was. And that's a beautiful and vibrant and enriching and textural and artistic and colourful communal life that is multi-hued, that we mustn't forget.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate you both being here. It's been fantastic to talk to you both.
Thank you.
Their Stories Unbroken is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the founders of the Bialik community, who in 1942, a time of tragedy and horror for the Jewish people and for so many others around the world, visioned and developed Bialik College as a new type of schooling for the youngest members of the Jewish community. I am immensely grateful for the support of Bialik College in supporting this podcast. A big thank you to Jeremy and Amanda for being both the first guests, but also my cheerleaders on this venture. Thank you to all the staff behind the scenes that have helped make their Stories Unbroken possible. I'd also like to offer a special thank you to the Bialik College Parents Association, as well as to musician Adam Starr. Additional thanks to Yad Vashem, the Gandel Foundation, and the many contributors that are too numerous to mention. Please check out the show notes for links, additional information, and how you can get in touch. Thank you for listening to Their Stories Unbroken.